Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another one of these videos in the series of all things lived experience. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we live, work and play on, and pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and give our undertaking to do all that we can to try and make the lives of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander peoples better in the future than what it's been since colonisation. And we acknowledge that this land was never ceded. And we also want to pay our respects to everyone with lived experience who's here with us today, and everyone watching, and people who don't even know that we exist. And we pay our respects to the lived experience movement's elders and the present people who are still fighting for our human rights and civic rights, and for those who are emerging. And we also pay our respects to people who care about people with lived experience. And we know that's all of you watching, because you wouldn't be bothered watching this if you didn't care. So today we're talking about the importance of lived experience and living experience in academia and research, and have the greatest of privileges to introduce you today to Louise Byrne, Michelle Banfield, and also to Lynn Mahoub from Western Australia. I'll ask them to tell you a little bit more about themselves though. So Louise, could you tell people about some of your experience? I know it won't be all, you are all such amazingly dedicated people that you've been involved in so much over the course of your careers.
Thanks, Faye. So in a snapshot, I've been in academia for 15 years now. I've been working from the perspective of my lived experience a lot longer than that. And I've worked in just about every sort of designated lived experience role that's existed. So I finished my PhD on lived experience workforce development in around 2014. And I've had a couple of research fellowships since then. I'm an adjunct assistant professor at Yale, and I do work a lot internationally. My focus is very much on understanding our workforce, the supports that are needed, defining our discipline better, and also promoting those things within research. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. There's so much more too. Michelle, could you tell people a little about you, please?
Thanks, Faye. Yes, so I've been doing lived experience research for just coming up on the anniversary of 20 years now, which scares me because I don't feel old enough to have been doing it for 20 years. I'm a professor and head of lived experience research at the Australian National University. I'm also a co-director and lived experience research lead for the Alive National Centre for Mental Health Research Translation. Everything that I've been doing over all of these years, I always find it what I call a happy accident of ending up in mental health research, and particularly lived experience research, because of the way my mental health affected my original career. And so I think of it as having a career that's driven by my own lived experience and by the connections that I have with others with lived experience. And particularly the role that I now have with the Alive National Centre is about how we embed lived experience and very much turn research inside out. So I look forward to having a great chat about a bit more of that.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And Lynn.
Hi, Faye. Thanks. Yes, great to be here from Wajak Noongar Boodja on WA land. I've been involved in a range of ways also for just over 20 years. But essentially, the activist bone in my body was activated very, very much earlier. My experiences of oppression, I was introduced to that early. And so the idea of thinking about power differently started very young. I work as a lived experience academic here at Curtin University in WA. I also have been in a range of other peer roles and peer leadership positions around the traps in lots of different ways over the years. But my interest and my focus is thinking deeply about how we can make more salient or visible to people that this is a social justice movement. this isn't a job. This is a movement. This is about connection to community. It doesn't, and the revolution doesn't happen between 9 and 5. It's about, how do we highlight in an era that is very much in a capitalistic frame, the importance of really stopping, pausing, and thinking about what does lived experience mean? What does working as a peer mean? And what's it have to do with oppression and human rights?
I think, Lynn, what you said, I think, is a key to the importance of lived experience in research and academia, is that it's a part of the movement. It's not just a job. So, Louise, can you tell me, what do you think, what is the difference between being a lived and living experience academic or researcher and being a researcher or academic that has lived experience? I think there's a big difference, but I'd like to hear what you think.
Well, actually, I won't tell you what I think, Faye. I'll tell you what the research findings showed us. So I'd actually done a number of studies to look at this, both here and in the US. And I think that's important because there are diverse views on it. And there are certainly folk who happen to have lived experience, who identify, I think that they are lived experience researchers that don't necessarily fit the way the wider workforce identifies. So it's not to negate the value of those perspectives, but as an emerging discipline, and we are still emerging, we need to be clear on what lived experience and lived expertise is and is not. So having lived experience is part of lived expertise, but it's only a component. Being out about your lived experience is also a component, but not the whole shebang. So in a nutshell, regardless of what role you're in, including a research role, one needs to have a few other factors that assist to build what we call lived expertise. Lived expertise is an intentionally developed knowledge base, which takes you beyond the individual experience, whatever your individual experience was. It connects you with the broader thinking, the international thinking that's happened over many decades, that this human rights movement, as Lynn rightly pointed out, has been developing from the same era that all the other human rights movements really started and began. So there is a considerable and a sophisticated body of knowledge that provides us with theory, which helps to underpin what we're doing, to justify and credentials to what we're doing, and also helps to guide our practice. What are the values and what are the principles of the work? So that's a really important component. Simply having your own individual lived experience does not allow you to speak from the collective viewpoint in quite the same way. And the other component, which is really important, is connection to that community. So it's about having networks, it's about having ongoing conversations, it's about reading the research and knowing what the thinking is, but it's also about being present and being part of the movement that Lynn mentioned earlier, and the to and fro that happens in that. So it's that cultivation of ideas, it's that robust discussion and debate, it's all the things that helps us stay current, because again, it is rapidly evolving. So it helps us to, for example, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, there's been a big shift, happily, towards understanding how intersectional perspectives can be represented quite differently. And we need to be representing intersectional perspectives quite differently, particularly folks from different cultures. So what we all need to do is be committed to ongoing learning, to being part of the networks that exist, the community that exists, to keep up to date with the evolving research, and to not only be able to express and communicate on what our own individual journey was, but to understand the common impacts that lots of us have experienced due to very frequent sorts of experiences like marginalization, social isolation, stigma, discrimination, loss of place in the world, all that kind of thing, which is common across many types of diagnosis. So basically, there's a few different ingredients. When all of those things come together, that's what we call built or developed lived expertise, and that is what distinguishes somebody as being a lived experience or a lived expertise worker or researcher.
I think that involvement in our community is so important, isn't it? Because we've all come to know each other and trust. You know, like I will talk with Louise and I'll talk with Michelle and Lynn because I trust them. I trust that they have come from that lived experience perspective, that this isn't just a role that they've stepped into from convenience, have said, oh, and by the way, I have lived experience. We've walked the hard roads, and I trust you because we've walked those hard roads together, and we are a part of the movement, and we've had our human rights stripped from us and our civic rights stripped from us. We know what that feels like. So as researchers and academics, the way we even pose questions may be different. Do you think that would be true to say, Michelle?
Yeah, and I was just thinking, I agree with everything that Louise just said, and was also thinking a question I get asked a bit, particularly within my own centre, where there's some people who have recent lived experience developing, with particularly as carers and those sort of things, is you know, how do we tell practically what the difference is? And so I've put a lot of thought into the practical side of things as well. And for me, it is very much about what you were just talking about with how we use all of the knowledge that we have when it comes down to decision making in research. And so, you know, for me, one of the core differences is how you're driven. And the way I talk about that with people is, for example, if you're writing a grant application, or if you're talking with somebody about the possibility of doing research and you have a choice between a method or an angle or a particular question that you know our lived experience communities focus on and have that angle, or a question or a method or a project that you know the funders will like, that decision actually then tells a lot about whether you're driving from a lived experience position. Because if you go with what the expertise and the community knowledge is telling you is the way to do it, is the angle that you take, is the issue to focus on, even though that may risk the academic side of things, that to me is how you demonstrate genuinely coming from a lived experience perspective and bringing that in to shifting what traditional research practice is actually about, and demonstrating that connection and that trust that we have with our communities.
And Lynn, you mentioned about the human rights. Our movement is based in human rights, of course. What do you think is important? Why do you think lived experience academia and lived experience research is important?
So I guess first I probably should mention that my role here is teaching only, but as a part of that, there is an expectation that one still does get involved in research. So I haven't had the same exposure that Michelle and Louise have had, but I do think about the particular obstacles that are often present in research. And so there's a few things around the publish or perish kind of sits there that can sort of interrupt people thinking differently about the different methodologies, such as Michelle was talking about. And so people can go for certain standard types of research methodologies. And so more unique ones, such as, you know, that might build on Indigenous or feminist or ethnomethodology, and, you know, discourse analysis and things like that, that for me really are of interest, where we can start to unpack power and language in research. So I guess it's our job to be thinking about human rights from the perspective of, where does oppression show up? Where does power show up? How do we unsettle power relations? How do we notice unequal power relations, even when it's ascribed to research methodologies? And, you know, there's that whole debate of, you know, sometimes people say qualitative methodologies are what they call fluffy, you know, kinds of methodologies. I would argue that that's where we get the voices of people, and really important knowledge can come out of our qualitative methods, and keeping on thinking outside of the envelope. So within both teaching and research, I would see our role as to be thinking broadly about social justice as a relation in relation to human rights, and thinking about epistemic injustice, and bringing those kinds of ideas into our research and our teaching as well, so that, and I think, I don't remember if it was Michelle or Louise was talking about earlier, building pathways, using our privilege to build pathways so that people can build that expertise, so they can be exposed to the bodies of knowledge, so they can learn about different mental models, so that we can recognise that there is not just one way to see the world or to understand distress or madness. And so that's essentially part of our role. I don't know if I answered your question there, but
That's great.
some thinking about linking them together.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you use the word privilege there, Lynn, when so often what those of us in the lived experience movement are talking about is the opposite of that. It's that having lost our privilege, all privileges just about, children taken away, no job, family left us, friends left us, that kind, license taken away, even the right to vote. I remember even having my right to vote taken away. So it's interesting that you bring in the term privilege, when I think we probably need to hold always those of us that are actually having a say. We do have a privilege, and we do have we have that responsibility, though. It isn't just a privilege, it's always encompassed. It must be overwhelmed, I think, by our responsibility to the people in our movement, the people who are still oppressed and who don't have the voice. And it often really worries me that there's so much recognition and understanding about depression and anxiety, but still those of us with diagnosis, and I don't like diagnosis, but those of us with diagnosis of bipolar, schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder are still really, out. We're the other. So yeah, I'd like to ask you about allies. Are there allies in lived experience academia and research? Or is it all just trying to push a stone up a hill all the time? Louise, would you like to answer?
I'll jump in on this. I would say there are a lot less allies than there are people claiming to be allies, and that I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that academia is a cesspit. It really is just a shark pond. It is one of the most cutthroat industries, and it's built on the backs of younger or emerging academics. It's very deliberately a Ponzi scheme, actually, in which people are typically exploited by superstar professors. That's the basis of academia. And then you take a situation where people see a sexy new topic like lived experience. Oh, that sounds interesting to me, having no real understanding about how important it is to people's human rights and to the emerging service culture that we want to build in this country. And so they pick it up like it's a trinket. Oh, I'm going to play with lived experience research for a while. They don't invest the time to understand what it really is about. I think partly, like, that's a lot of sort of blaming language. On the other side, it is new and it is an emerging area, so people don't understand how deeply lived experience workers and researchers understand our discipline and how very, very different it is from every other way of working. So in some respects, it's not necessarily anyone's fault. But if you take a system like the academy, which is built on the principle of exploitation effectively, and then you add in folks like ourselves who have had privilege taken from us so many times, who don't understand and not exposed to the processes, the language, the jargon, the power words of the academy, most people are not, then you've got a great recipe for exploitation, whether inadvertently or otherwise. And so what we're seeing is that folks are picking up lived experience like it's some sort of little fun thing to play with. They're not understanding how central lived expertise needs to be to actually drive real and meaningful research. They're fiddling around the edges which means that they're co-opting and coercing folk who are working in lived experience roles to develop research findings which ultimately don't represent truly our perspectives or our disciplines. So we're getting a muddied evidence base. We're getting people burnt out. We're getting a lot of folks who are not provided with basic research skills or understanding, and they're being given the title of lived experience researcher. That doesn't benefit anyone. They don't have the power or the influence to have impact or to, guide the discussions that are happening. So it's frankly a bit of a dog's breakfast at this point. And what we need is a lot more education and a lot more understanding. And when it comes to those few allies, and they really are very few, far in between, these are folk who actually put their own career advancement to the side. These are folk who actually choose to put the movement and the human rights and the enormous needs of hundreds of thousands of millions of people ahead of their own next promotion or their next, big category 1 grant or whatever. And they say, what can I do? How can I support you? And they lift us up genuinely, rather than bringing us in, subsuming us into their work and to their career and to their goals and ambitions. And that we need to see more and more of. And we also need more and more lived experience-led spaces, discrete spaces, where we can do our business without interference and influence from other disciplines, because it really is making things, it's very difficult to distinguish at the moment when we talk about lived experience research. Has that really been led by lived expertise? Or is it a couple of people chucked onto a project with little bits of, input that ultimately don't guide, and don't lead to the sort of findings that we find? So there's a lot to tease out. And what I would say is that if you're an ally who has a casual interest in this, go find something else to focus on, please. In the same way, look, I've worked in many First Nations communities and organisations over the years when I was invited in, only when I was invited in, and I knew my place and I knew what it meant to be an ally, and that is to provide support and assistance in the spaces that I could, and that others, folks from the First Nations community, identified, and they would tell me what was useful. And that's what we need from our allies as well, to stop thinking that they can come in and tell us what needs to happen and to drive things, but to make space for us to drive.
So you sort of feel like, I have certainly experienced this in the service delivery world, that positions more senior than peer. It doesn't need to be much more senior than peer, but especially those ones that are being established that are executive type roles, they are very often being colonised by people who haven't been members of the movement, who don't really know. They know their own experience, but lived experience is very different to lived expertise and knowing what our community needs. Michelle, what's been your experience with allies?
Look, I have to say, for me, allies is one of those terms that make me twitch. And that's because I've had a lot of experience in terms of the people who name themselves as an ally generally aren't. They're the sort of people that Louise was talking about, who do it for the look at me, look what I can do. I saw a big discussion back and forth a few years ago in the letter to the editor section of a journal about people who wanted to position themselves as an allies because they could go into spaces where people with lived experience couldn't. And the response from people who were lived experience leaders was, excuse me, we can do that for ourselves. And I've seen quite a lot of people who call themselves allies who are anything but. And as Louise said, academia is cutthroat. More than any other industry, we on the surface are supposed to collaborate, where in the reality all we are doing is competing with one another, and it just creates this breeding ground of people who want to do anything they can to make themselves look better than anyone else. I agree that lived experience has become a trendy thing. It's partly because there's a lot of sticks involved now from the grants perspective. It is becoming something you have to have. And that is also a breeding ground for people who want to just hitch into it and call themselves an ally and do nothing ally. I would say there are some genuine allies out there that generally don't call themselves that. And so I think it's a term that, as I said, it makes me twitch. And I'm also very careful. One of my new roles is as chair of the ANU Human Research Ethics Committee, which in that role, I'm having a lot more to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, and the same through the Alive National Centre and some of the projects that we're doing there. And so, same as Louise, being invited into spaces and being very careful about that. And when talking with people, I describe myself as, in inverted commas, an ally in training, because I want to understand that I can never come from that position because I'm not from an Indigenous background, but I want to actually understand what it genuinely means to be able to work with people in those spaces. And so that's what I'm looking for people who preferably don't call themselves an ally in our space, but who are looking to help and, support, I guess, because we are perfectly capable of doing these things ourselves, being successful, leading in these spaces and doing genuine lived experience research. But, there are plenty of people who will do this through a very traditional path who, because academia has not caught up yet, will naturally have an advantage over people who drive from a lived experience and lived expertise perspective. And so we do still need their help in order to, what I call turn the Titanic of research, and move from lived experience being included in everything and leading everything because of the grant stick, and it actually becoming the genuine thing that we do. And that's where we need proper allies.
Okay, thanks so much for that. Louise, I know that you have to leave now. It's been fantastic that you've given us some of your really precious time. It's precious to us anyway. So I would like to ask you though, before you leave, is there one thing, if you had one wish about lived and living experience, academia and research, what would that be?
It would be that all the funding bodies, the major funding bodies, and all the people who want to work with lived experience researchers would be required to do some mandatory training to have a basic understanding around what lived experience and lived expertise is and is not, and to have some, to therefore build some value around who we are and the authenticity of our work, and be committed to protecting and promoting the authenticity of our work instead of twisting it to fit the already existing system. Because at the moment, there are limits on how useful we can be in terms of changing the evidence base, because the status quo is so prominent and prevalent throughout the research system. Yeah, there's just so little scope at the moment for anything new to really be done that I'm just worn out with it, frankly. And I think that it's going to continue to be a really rough road for a lot of people. I really wish that folks who want to work with us, and particularly funding agencies who say they want to promote our space, spend the time, invest the time, understand what you're talking about. Stop just putting words on pages and ticking boxes, and bloody commit properly. Do it properly. That's my fervent wish, and I will be a very happy little camper if it comes true one day. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. I just want you to know, Louise, that you've given our community so much, and we love you and value you for it. I'll never forget the first time I saw you speak, Louise, and I was blown away then, and I'm still really blown away. And thank you for everything you've given us. Thank you.
May I return the compliment, Faye, and thank you, and you will be dearly missed, and I love you deeply.
Thank you, Louise. Bye.
Bye. See you, Michelle and Lynn.
Lynn, what has been your experience in working with people who have called themselves allies? Have they been allies, and what are real allies in the lived experience space?
Thanks, Faye. I have had the privilege of being with some real allies, and that's been really exciting, and it's what's enabled me to stay in this space. The starting point is my own learning that I still need to do as an ally in a range of spaces, LGBT spaces, Indigenous spaces. I politicise my identity as an individual, and so I want to, even though I have got family experiences, I want to deeply think about my allyship and I do deeply think about my allyship in relation to people that are in family, carer, kin, significant other positions as well. So I think the question around allyship is one for all of us to consider, and also some of the things that Michelle and Louise were highlighting is that it is a systemic issue, and the fact that people can slide into colonization and perhaps more tokenistic kind of ways of being is because those, might be grant bodies or funding bodies or whatever, haven't built it in as a part of their systems. And so there is a stick, and there's also some carrots. But there isn't any sticks and carrots to actually deeply understand the authenticity of what's needed. And I'm not going to call it authentic engagement, because in Australia and around the world, we have been moving away from this notion of representation, or we've been wanting to. Nothing's happened about that much. But we need to think about, or the powers that be need to think about, what does leadership look like, and move beyond the representational models that currently exist. The other thing I think about when it comes to allyship is the link between some of the disciplines that we're talking about and their own origins and their own bodies of knowledge that we would love to see in practice. So I think about critical social work, critical psychiatry, critical psychology, my own discipline, critical nursing, and there's been some amazing allies in those spaces. I think about social psychiatrists that have been involved in the Hearing Voices approach and so on. And so there is a pathway within one's own discipline if one goes back to the roots of the, the connection with the human rights and social justice that people can draw on. And I guess the other thing that I think about in relation to this work is that it involves, for me, but for others, a deep understanding and commitment to growing our reflexivity. And by that, I'm talking about self-awareness, other awareness, and learning about different ways of being and doing. And so we want to see that in a clinician on the ward today. This is not something just in academia. And so how is it that we can help ourselves and people who may want to be allies understand, as a colleague of mine termed the phrase, the seduction of inclusion, and shout out to Margaret Doherty there. But the seduction of inclusion can affect us all. We all want to have belonging. That's what sits under this whole madness. We're ostracized from society. We're outside of belonging. And so the more we think about belonging and what it takes to be invited in, to not just rush in, to notice that one's just rushed in and I'm here and I know. We want to move beyond the I know to the I don't know, I would argue. And we're figuring it out together, and trying to work to change the systems and the mental models, the ways of thinking about, in our case, mental health and AOD, so that the research, as Louise was saying, what's in the research isn't representative of what we want to see. We want to see those old mental models unsettled. And how is it that we can leverage that? I did a critical bibliography recently about the social construction of schizophrenia. There's been stuff in the literature about that for years and years and years. However, we don't mobilise that as a way to unsettle the old mental models. How is it that we can start to break the barriers around some of this knowledge and share it together so that we can move beyond words on a page to actually understanding what the words are that we're using?
two really important points that came out to me that I'd really like to speak with you both about. The first one is I think perhaps we've all might have said colonisation. We've talked about colonisation, but when people watching this video may not understand what we're talking about when we say that in reference to academia or research.
I guess sometimes we use the word colonisation and co-option interchangeably. And so when an idea that might have had a grassroots origin, well-meaningly, is taken on board and then tried to be put into a model, it can gain some things, but it can lose some things. And so I guess when I think about it, I think about how do we keep an eye on what we might gain and what we might lose? How can we be accountable for the implications of a view, my own included? What am I missing? What am I not seeing here? And as I think about the term colonisation, for me, I think a lot about the impacts of cultural colonisation that our Indigenous people around the world experience. And also I think about a worry about how have our minds been colonised by particular ways of thinking. And that's when I talk about the mental models or worldviews or frameworks of understanding distress. I was talking with a group of people recently who work in the industry, and they hadn't even heard about the biomedical model as a way of seeing things. It just was.
Yes.
And so therefore the fact that there are other ways of understanding madness or distress from a psychological or a spiritual or a cultural point of view, a political, socio-environmental, socio-economic, intersectional ways of understanding experience, that's often new news. And so when I think about this idea of our minds being colonized and words like mental illness just being rolling off the tongue, often people might not have heard that actually that's a contested term. There's a reason why it's contested. It might have some utility in certain settings, it may be really useful in other settings, but there's implications of just looking at humans through one lens, in that if we only talk about and think about people as having broken brains, we never attend to the poverty and impoverishment of people and housing. So all around Australia at the moment, the housing issue is contributing massively to mental distress. But when we think about mental illness as being only about this idea of broken brain, we forget and we let politicians off the hook for addressing poverty and homelessness and unemployment and discrimination and all the things that social and structural determinants that impact our well-being.
I think when I think about and certainly the term colonisation, by using it in mental health, should not be detracting from the viciousness of it, of what it's caused to Aboriginal people in any way. But I think that co-option of the language, say in service delivery, it's in the language of diagnosis. Like if I hear a peer worker using a term like Joe is a schizophrenic, then that peer worker has been colonised or co-opted into using the language of psychiatry. Whereas if I was working as a peer worker, I would just talk about Joe. Joe has this terrible problem that he needs some support with, about housing or something like that. I would not say Joe's a schizophrenic and he's having difficulty finding housing. Well, no wonder he's a schizophrenic, so it's really simple when you see it that way. But in academia and research, I think it is still very much about language and also ways of thinking. And I do worry when I see papers written by lived experience academics who've really taken in the language of the very high up, egotistical, typical academics that have been around for decades, that have really claimed the space as experts We need to be modelling the language of lived experience academia and lived experience research, and that we influence the way they think and see and write to come over much more to the way our movement needs them to be. Then we might actually start to make some changes. But Michelle, can I ask you, we've got lived experience academia and lived experience research. What value is it, do you think, to service delivery or societal thinking? Two different things.
Yeah, look, yeah, that's a Pandora's box, Faye. Look, I mean, the way I come at this, sometimes I have to do what Lynn was talking about and be reflexive about my own reactions to a lot of these sort of things, because I sometimes sit back and go, this is a no-brainer. You know, people with lived experience, service users, people with mental illness, whatever the way they want to actually portray themselves, they are the ultimate end users of whatever we are trying to do within research, whatever we are doing within service. And so it kind of tends to explode my head when I think about people who argue that we're not the ones who should be driving all of this, and that we're not the ones who can say what works and what doesn't work and what we actually need out of things. And I think, you know, I've spent way too much time thinking about such things, and you know, I tie myself in knots sometimes with it, going, I don't even understand, except that it comes back to the epistemic injustice issue of why you would not lead from a position of lived experience, because we are living these experiences, we are living all of these things. We know very well what it is that we need from services, and by extension by research, and the crossover between those two things. So, you know, I'm often flabbergasted when I see people who argue still that there is no place in their work for lived experience, because I think you are so out of touch with how this really works. And I was just thinking, when you were talking about language then, Faye, there was a paper that was released the other week in a inaugural issue of a new journal that's out, that I had a paper in as well, which it attracted my attention because it was supposedly about understanding historical language and that sort of thing. And it ended up to me being an example of how this is self-reinforcing, because they traced, using large algorithms and that sort of thing, they traced the most common terms over about a century worth of publishing. And they're a bit limited for a start in that they had mental health, mental disease, which made me cringe, mental disorder, mental illness, and a few other, and most recently mental health, which has become that euphemism thing. And they came to this conclusion that mental disorder was the one that was the most common, and that there's no evidence that there's any stigmatizing differences between any of them. So let's all just go with mental disorder. And my reaction when I got to the end of it was, excuse me? Did you ask anyone with lived experience about how they feel about that? And also, I can tell you straight away, I'm not diseased, and I do not feel like disease, disorder, health, illness, and those sort of things are actually equivalent when it comes to stigma, but certainly internally. And yet this paper, because it was published by somebody quite high profile in psychology, is going to reinforce the use of the term mental disorder, because they've come to the conclusion that that's the one that's the most common, and that there's, you know, not much evidence out there that it makes any difference. So I still see sort of that there is a lot of self-reinforcement that happens in this stuff. And that's why it is so important that we push hard now for lived experience to be embedded, central, and leading, because we do know these things. And even just watching the expressions on your faces when I was telling that little thing there told me so much about why it is critical for us to lead from lived experience.
I think we talk about, we know that language is really important in how we speak in services. For example, Flourish Australia, we wrote our own strengths-based language guide because we felt that the other strengths-based language guides that were out there didn't go far enough. You know, they still included things like diagnosis. I don't think that non-lived experience academics have really recognised the power in the different words that they use and how that inflicts our lives and others us in every aspect of our life, whether it just be being a mum, not that that's just, or having a job or not having a job in the community, or being in a psych ward, or being a peer worker or a lived experience executive, or being an academic. The language is still always really powerful. But I don't think that people other than people with lived experience recognise the power and the pain that language causes. Lynn, you're a teacher, you're teaching at university. Do you cover this, the power of language and the damage and the healing it can bring about?
Absolutely, where we can, we bring it in because it's crucial what you're talking about there, Faye. I mean, I see it in funding bodies. I see it in procurement systems. Even the notion that we're funding recovery apparently oriented things. I'm really curious about how everybody seems to understand this word peer or this word recovery or this word mental health. I mean, Ron Coleman used to argue really what we've got is mental illness systems, not mental health systems. And so I guess where it leaves me is, and I feel like I might have been around for a while, but I'm still always learning. And I deeply think about how can we respond in the moments to unsettled, taken for granted assumptions and use of language, you know, and how can people with me do that with me? How can I be open to that? How can I model that? And I wonder about particularly how we can for our students, our social work, OT and other students, how can we help them think more deeply about the implications of words and the power of words? We've got some neat little exercises that and activities that we use in the classroom, even understanding that there's a binary construction often occurring and how can we create liminal spaces in between, linking that to the question that you asked earlier, which is what value might there be in us being in the academy, MAD identified in the academy, as Pete Beresford might coin it, is that we can think about how to help our movement and our peers to understand that words have power. I'm very interested in imagery as well. So a lot of conferences have the image of a brain. You know, we really need to think deeply about why don't we have an image of poverty there instead of a brain? We have to start to notice. And one of the exercises that we do, we have a MAD studies unit that we run, and we get people to do a textual analysis where they just get an organisation's so-called fact sheet and start to look critically at the language that's used there. And is it really a fact? You know, did somebody just declare it so? So how can we unsettle our thinking about these so-called fact sheets that are on the shelf of many services? Where's the evidence and whose voice counts as evidence? And so there's ways that we can use our position and our creativity and research and teaching, not only in the day, but also at night, helping people find plain language pieces of grey literature and so forth. Rachel Waddingham, for example, has got a great piece out there to get us thinking critically about, will we continue to use the term symptom? Is it useful? What are the implications of continuing to use the word symptom? Same with the term sign. In psychiatry, there are no signs. Signs are measurable and testable against the norm, but do we continue to use the word sign? I'm not so sure about that. That's for each of us to decide for ourselves, because there is no blood test x-ray. So how can we start as a movement thinking critically about our language so that we can unsettle various disciplines around us and ask critical questions? That's my wondering about it.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Lynn. I recently I've been thinking, you know, we've heard about trauma informed. Everything's been trauma informed for a long time. First of all, it was recovery, and then it went to trauma informed, or you know, all of that. I think it's trauma, grief, and betrayal, and they're really tightly bound together. And I think that we really need to be exploring this idea and pulling it apart and recognizing what people are actually really dealing with, rather than just putting it all in this, oh, this trauma informed box and that can sit over there, because we all know about it. Michelle, I was wondering, you've been involved, as you said, for over 20 years, and I think, Lynn, you said about the same time. Is that right? Can I ask you both how far you think lived experience, academia and research has come? Is it finding a footing? Is it having an impact? What do you think, Michelle?
When I think about what it was like when I first came into this area, you know, I described it as a happy accident. Maybe it's an unhappy accident. I should be careful about what I say about some of these things. But, you know, it did happen that I was at the end of, you know, what is probably my most acute and serious experience, and just happened across this job that was advertised at the Centre for Mental Health Research. And when I looked it up and did my due diligence in applying for a job, I discovered they had a thing called a consumer research unit. What is that? And discovered that, you know, this was a unit that had been created to privilege lived expertise. And I went, well, that's an interesting thing. I've never heard of such a thing, but I'm going to actually own up in my application for a basic research assistant position that that's part of my expertise. But when I started here, I have to say, even though that was quite unusual then for there to be a consumer research unit, it was this thing that was over to the side. And I have to say that, you know, over a period of the last 20 years, it has shifted. At ANU, the Centre for Mental Health Research is completely grant money funded. And so it grows and shrinks according to our success in grants. So it's really, really fluid. And at one point in recent years, I actually had the biggest team. And everybody in my team, one of the criteria for joining my team is that you have a lived experience and that you want to come and learn about how you use that lived experience in being a researcher and move into what we've been talking about as a lived experience researcher. And so for me to have the largest team in what is quite a successful academic research centre was quite unusual. And I don't think would have happened when I started 20 years ago. So I think that's something that I've seen. And, you know, talking about the major competitive grants getting to a point where there is an expectation of lived experience involvement. It's nowhere near where it should be yet, but I think it's getting runs on the board for that to even exist at all. And that the big work that we have now to do is in the how we facilitate that to happen properly. But of course, there's a lot of surface level stuff, and that's the difficulty side of things, is that I've observed and I've pushed and I've participated in a lot of change from, you know, an HR perspective, from a research practice perspective, from a general academic perspective, of getting some of the surface level policy stuff changed, thinking about, you know, Faye, you always echo in my why not a peer? You know, that's always in my head of how can we actually push towards understanding that lived expertise is central, critical, and a no-brainer. And so we're getting to the point of that being understood in the mechanisms, but then when you have to actually put those policies into practice is when you discover that they are just policies, that you will still be treated in a stigmatizing way, that the epistemic injustice is there. You know, that I have had it said to me when there are, you know, pointy end things going on, are you sure that, you know, it's not just because you have a mental illness that you see this.
Mm.
And so those things are always there and are there extra work. And especially, you know, we're working, and I completely support the importance of us having lived experience leaders. But I do think that we have to understand that our leaders are fighting their own battles. They're fighting the battles of their teams, and they're fighting the systemic battles as well. And in somewhere like academia, where you're fighting the bureaucracy constantly, we need to make sure that we are really supporting the people who are taking up all of those fights so that they don't disappear, you know.
Lynn, what do you think about this idea?
I think it's important to keep asking the question. I can lose sight of the wins, you know, so I wrestle with these questions all the time, as we do in service land. I have been blessed to have seen lots of amazing leadership and allyship as a part of my journey. And one of the key features of the allyship is people have been door openers and not door closers. So one job is to be a door opener, and I had an amazing colleague who not only helped perhaps open doors, but step back and say, invite people in and celebrate ideas and join with me in making those ideas come alive. And so our work here is to bring on others as sessional academics, other people with lived experience. It must be counted. It must be counted that folks have signed up for that. The barriers that other academics face in an institution exist for our lived experience educators as well, because the institutions are there to serve a particular purpose, and the focus in a university is obviously teaching the students and research. And so that brings lots of barriers. And as you said to Louise Fay, you know, what she's given us, we can point to. I can be at a meeting, at a senior meeting outside the academy, inside the academy, wherever, and say, have you looked at the lived experience body of literature? We have one now, you know, and that, I think, is crucial. If the currency of our society is peer-reviewed journals, which it is in certain instances, we've got some currency. And, you know, the fact that, you know, as Michelle was explaining, being in connection with Alive, such an important, it's a national project. And to be able to be influencing at that level, it's not enough. Our mantra is it's not enough, you know, where do we push next? Absolutely. Because this is people's lives at stake. We've got human rights and social justice issues happening all the time. But I think it is important to count the fact that not only are we able to contribute publications, we can help and be mentors to others who may not even be in the academy to contribute to publications. So we've got reach, and that's what I was talking about in terms of using our privilege. It's like we've got to get really creative about our reach and what happens after dark, you know, and how do we mobilize the movement. Michelle was saying about reading that journal and feeling, well, my words for it are, you know, a sense of outrage. It's like, how do we share that journal article? How do we join a paper? How do we, you know, find time, because it won't happen between 9 and 5 because we've got our jobs to do. But how can we possibly make commentary in that journal so that we can, you know, and we have some power to be able to do that. But again, it does come, and I think you sort of alluded to it, Michelle, you know, the emotional labour that it takes to deal with certain framings. We get framed in certain ways that are stigmatizing in some quarters. Yeah, how do we get our voices out there and really use this little bit of academic power that we've got to in the service of the mission of the movement? And I think there's a lot we can do.
We don't know the impact, the positive impact we're having on our community. We don't hear it, we don't see it very often. Every now and again, something happens and you get told that, you know, that you've been really influential, positively influential in a person's life or whatever, but mostly we don't know. And Michelle and Lynn and Louise, you probably all don't have a clue of how positive an impact you're having on our community, on our workplaces, on our individual lives as well. You know, just knowing that this isn't just me saying these words. I can quote Michelle, I can quote Lynn, I can quote Louise. You know, it gives me gravitas that I don't have without you, you know, and I think that's what's really important for our lived experience academics to know, and researchers to know, that we're listening, we need you, it's powerful to us, you know.
The other kind of thing that we don't often hear about, and I'll give a shout out to Vrinda and Indy and others, you know, who might have contributed to YouTube, and how their clips, you know, we use in teaching, and we, you know, using peer work and those sorts of things, and we don't necessarily know or hear about the fact that those precious words we might have said are part of that expertise and that that body of knowledge that everyone's contributing. We are all a drop in that ocean of that body of knowledge that we're growing and growing and growing. And seeing that, as you said, is so important. So yeah, I just want to give a shout out to others that aren't here that have contributed to that all around the world.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, I see myself as a peer because I still work in the ethics of peer, the values of peer. And in research, I'm wondering, do you still see yourselves as peers, and do you still get that same kind of gaslighting that we get as people with lived experience who are forced into or in the system, and then in workplace as people with lived experience, you know, if we're angry about something that should not have happened, but because we were angry about it, as anybody would be, we're asked whether, you know, whether our mental health is okay. Are we sleeping? Are we taking our pills? That hasn't been happening to me at Flourish. But I'm wondering, Michelle, is that what you're talking about, that kind of gaslighting of our experience in academia and research as well?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, Faith. I'm going to call a spade here and say, yes, I have experienced that kind of thing, but some of what I've experienced is downright discrimination.
Yeah.
And, you know, we just have to call it out. You know, I saw an interesting discussion around a lot of what we call stigma is discrimination, and we should call it discrimination, and stop, you know, using a euphemism there for something that, when it's behavioural, we are being discriminated against. And now that I have, or am beginning to have, a better understanding of what gaslighting is about, yes, I see it a lot, and I actually think it's a very common practice within academia in general. And again, it's bred by the fact that it's research in academia in particular, which is, you know, I'm a research intensive academic, so that's the side of things that I see. It is competitive, full stop. And even your best friend is going to be your competitor at some point. And so when there are soft targets, like being able to question somebody's sanity or the way they're behaving or something like that, they're soft targets. And so people will use them. It's the way people are. And that's not to say, you know, I mean, I tend to describe myself as a disruptor, so I do dig myself into holes that invite this kind of behaviour, but that's kind of the way I see the way we actually have to progress some of this sort of stuff. And so I feel like in some ways I do have to accept that there are plenty of people who are going to take advantage of the target that I paint on myself by being a disruptor and by going into these spaces and by asking the tough questions. And also by just saying, you know, I have the lived experience that I have whatever label it is that you want to use at the time. That means that I'm not going to be able to moderate all of my behavior or behave the way people want me to all of the time. It's just not the way it is. And that's also a part of my disruption and my advocacy and what we have to do. And if I then have to understand what it means when somebody wants to use that in gaslighting, and then start to push back on the things that enable that, well, okay, there's another piece of that emotional labour that Lynn was talking about.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think so often it is actually discrimination. I rarely use the word stigma now because I recognise that I, you know, all levels of society, right through to government, you know, the heads of the country use that word to be able to skirt away from being discriminating. So, Lynn, can I ask you, if you had the same question that I asked Louise, if you had a wish, one wish could come true about lived experience, academia and research, what would that be, Lynn?
I guess I'm gonna bring it back to us, and I would wish for us in these roles to find more, and it could be funding, it could be creativity, it could be whatever it is, such that we can create pathways out of the academy, if you like, to the people. I think about the person today now who is, or people living under a bridge, for the people who are on a lock ward right now. What are the ways in which we can build the movement for such that their experience tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow is different and is better? I think the thing that strikes me about, talk about language, a lot of the time our language is very service centric. It's about how can we get people into services, what can services do to support. I want to get people out. This is an emancipatory movement. This is about freedom. This is about getting people out of services and to the right resources and have their rights upheld such that we can live quality lives. And so I guess I would wish for us, I don't know, that magic wand so that we can take the mad studies knowledge out there, queer studies, feminist wisdoms, Indigenous wisdoms, and reach the people so that our movement can build its expertise. It isn't about, you know, as Louise was saying, and Michelle, you know, it's about that expertise. We want people in roles that have the expertise as well as the experiences that they bring, and critical thinking, understanding, co-option, seduction of inclusion. That's for us to get. And once we get it, I guess I'm a bit Pollyanna again. It's the power of the people. We really, really build this movement. Who knows what we can achieve?
That's fantastic. Michelle, can I ask you the same question? If you had one wish, what would that be?
My big wish is about acceptance. And for that, I don't just mean acceptance within the academy and within research and with others. I mean acceptance within our movement as well, for the diversity that we've been talking about, acceptance of the different positions that we hold, and acceptance of what it is that we're all trying to achieve so that we can then achieve acceptance more broadly.
I think I found the lateral violence so hard for the first 20 years of my involvement in the lived experience movement, but then I realised that every marginalised community has that same experience. You know, it's when people haven't had a voice and then they start to get a voice, they sometimes the getting that voice louder begins at choosing the soft targets that you were talking about before, Michelle, and we take it out on each other. But we need to be building each other up rather than tearing each other apart, so that we can become the voice and the power that we want to be. And I don't use that word power in the traditional sense. I mean, just having the power to have our human rights and our civic rights met, and not feeling like we're going to be destroyed, you know, or knocked out in the next minute. Before we finish today, is there anything else that you would like to say?
I just want to thank you for making the space, Faye. It doesn't happen very often, and you know, it really warmed my heart when you reached out about this, and I was so happy to be a part of it. It's been great to actually have the opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Michelle. Lynn, is there anything you'd like to say?
I'm really interested in conversations, coming together to think about things together. Doesn't, as Michelle said, doesn't happen that often. And it's really special to be able to do it with yourself at this point in your career. You've been such a pinnacle in this movement, and I know that you're going to be doing many, many more great things, just in a different space. But yeah, to be able to be a part of it and just have a yarn, been a privilege and a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, I didn't ask you that question, so I think you would both pat me on the back, but I really appreciate it anyway. So I really want to, before you go though, Michelle and Lynn, just the same as with Louise, you know, I just value you both so much. And you've buoyed me at times when I thought we had no hope, and you've kept that hope alive. And I thank you so much for putting yourselves into these really difficult situations. It's hard being in these places, in these situations, when you're forging the way, and that's what you've both done. That's what Louise has done. And it's so hard clearing that pathway so that others can come behind as well, and then overtake us and go on ahead. And I really thank you so much for everything you've done and everything you'll continue to do. Thank you for being with us and for all you do for our people. Thank you.